Hello to you, Dudley Anderson here on The Reality Show right here on Revelation Television. So good to be with you once again. Well, The Reality Show is all about talking to people from across the board whose lives have been impacted by the reality of knowing Jesus. Colossians 2:17 tells us that the ways of man are but a shadow. The reality can only be found in a real relationship with God through Jesus Christ. Well, from broken hands to healing hands. Today we speak with Allen Langham. Allen Langham had a prosperous prospect of a future as a professional rugby league player, but sadly he gave it all up on a pursuit of drink, drugs and organised crime. Allen says his hands caused untold damage, breaking bones, breaking lives. In fact, his own hands have been broken many times in fights. But then he said Jesus stepped into his life and gave him what brawling and boozing could not. Today, Allen Langham uses his hands for healing. Allen, thank you so much for joining us today on The Reality Show.
Hi, good morning. How are you doing?
Very good, thank you indeed. Well, from broken hands to healing hands. Your story can be found in your book, The Taming of a Villain. Tell us your story, Allen. How did you find Jesus?
About 10 years ago now, at the point of absolute desperation, I was in a prison cell contemplating how to end my life. I was completely just so rock bottom, just so disgusted in the man that I'd become. I was let down as a father, as a person, as a member of the community, to my family. I was feared, not respected. I'd lost all self-respect and dignity. And I was wandering around the wing just thinking, how am I going to end my life? And I decided I was going to take a lot of medication and just drift off to sleep. But that day I'd gone down to the chapel, and I really feel it was significant because as the ministers in there were praying for us, there were me and another guy and another minister were praying about fathers, us being let down to our children and also not having fathers in our lives. And I just came away from there so stirred up inside that, I just, this God thing's got to be real. I need to know. But at this time of my life, I was mentally insane. I'd had 3 different diagnoses. I was under a psychiatrist and I was acutely paranoid. So I dropped down to my knees, crying from the pits of my stomach. The snot was dripping down my face. I was just so emotionally distraught. And I said silently in my mind, because I used to think that the prison walls could record our voices. So I said it silently, God, if you're real, if you are with me and you're hearing the silent cries of anguish of me in the night, replace the pigeons outside my prison window for the white bird, for the dove. And I just went to sleep, got up in the morning. I used to smoke in those days, so I made a roll up, went to the window, and outside my window there was an apex opposite that always used to have the pigeons there. The dreary grey background. I just used to feel horrible. And then, like in slow motion, the pigeons lifted up and the white bird just sat down, and something inside me jumped. It was like an electric shock, and I came running out the cell saying, there is a God, there is a God, he's real, I know he's with me. And that very day, I just give my heart over to Jesus that day, because it was everything that I'd asked for silently. And I've been searching for such a long time for the truth, for the real, something real in my life, and also the replacement of a father. And he became my father that day.
That's amazing. It's amazing how God uses little things like that, a hardened criminal, and he uses a dove to speak to you. Incredible stuff. Now, Allen, your life didn't start in prison. You started out as a rugby league player. Tell us about your early days in the sport.
Yeah, so at the age of 16, I'd been kicked out of school. I wasn't, I left with no qualifications because all my heart, all my dreams and desires were to be a pro rugby player. I'd started as a 12-year-old, and by 16 years old, I was starting to be scouted and watched. My local club, Doncaster, said, don't sign for anybody. We'll pay you £50 a week not to sign with anybody and go around the schools with our overseas players. They went into liquidation that year, and they were going to merge with Sheffield Eagles. That merger never happened, but Sheffield Eagles asked me to go over for talks. And just after my 17th birthday, I signed professional rugby league for Sheffield Eagles as a 17-year-old. I was full of skill and talent, but no discipline, and certainly no positive role models around me, other than my brother-in-law who acted as a manager for me. But I foolishly got sucked into nightclubs and the party lifestyle with some of the older players. At that time, there was a lot of steroids on the scene as well, so I used steroids, and rather than knuckling down and kind of training hard, I thought I'd made it. I had the bad attitude, the ill discipline, started to go into the nightclubs and threw away an immense talent. At that time, in that club, there was 8 Great Britain internationals. I was, it was the pinnacle of rugby league. Super League was the highest division. It's equivalent to the Premier League in football. And I threw that away for drink, drugs, nightclubs, women. And inevitably that led to a lot of trouble.
Yes, absolutely. So you started out, you were actually signed up. Did you play any big games?
Yeah, so I played the first season as a pro. So I started in the academy, played my first game in the academy away at Rochdale, scored 4 tries, and was then put straight into the reserves. And then I got a man of match performance then, and then I was in the first team squad. So after 3 games, I was in the squad for the first team. The talent, there was nothing wrong with the talent. I was a big, powerful, strong guy, full of anger, full of hurt, full of letdown. And then thankfully, rugby league had saved me from a lot of my own self-destructive ways, and it was an outlet. I used to call it legalised violence. But inevitably, that ill discipline would cause you not to make it as a pro long term. And that's why I say to a lot of young people today, talent is not everything. There is more to it. You've got to have the discipline as well.
Absolutely, the discipline I think is significant. Rugby is a contact sport. It's a very active sport, and you as a strong and dare I say volatile guy would expound your energies and your aggression out on the pitch. So, yeah, you mentioned discipline. What would be your advice to a young man, perhaps just like you, who is getting into the sport? He's big, he's strong, but he's aggressive. How do you channel that aggression on a rugby pitch?
I think a lot of the culture's changed now, Dudley. I think there was a big culture thing because there was a big drinking culture. That steroid abuse was widespread. Like nutrition and all that and the sport science wasn't around in those days. It would kind of, some of the guys would literally go out to the nightclub and then go and play the next day, even as pros. So you was around that culture. But for me, it's kind of, looking back, there was a couple of players who were exceptional role models. Remember Sonny Wakaru, he was in New Zealand, and he used to pick me up before I had a car and take me to training and take me around the schools, and I used to train in the gym with him. And he had such a disciplined way of approaching, everything he did. The first thing he ever did in the morning is go out and train himself. And he said, look, no matter how much training is around the club, you need to do your own twice as much as anybody else because you need to be the pinnacle. So that training mentality really helped with focus and, challenge the aggression. But also I think it's, now it's dealing with those core issues. At the time when I'd signed pro, my mum had only been dead a couple of years. I'd never processed that trauma or that hurt that I was feeling or going through. I'd masked it in the fighting and the drinking and the kind of going into the nightclubs, and I was running away from my own pain and trauma. And I think that's my advice to young people is to get support for what it is you're going through, because most people who are aggressive is because there's a root cause of that aggression, and it's finding what that root cause is and dealing with that root cause.
Absolutely, and get back to the sport like boxing. You know, you need to be angry, you need to be aggressive because that's the nature of the sport. But there's also an element of respect in it, to respect your opponent, respect yourself, you know, and what you say is absolutely right and true. So, Alan, you left rugby because you got involved in drugs and drink. Did it rob you of your sport, or was it a conscious decision? You're just going to walk away from it. What happened next?
No. It was far from conscious. What had happened is two of the senior pros had been given 3 months custody each because they got caught speeding, racing each other in the new cars on the M1, and they both got 3 months custody. Two of our senior players. So Gary Everton was the coach at the time, the head coach. He called everybody in from academy, reserve, second team, and the first team squad. Called everybody in and said, anybody who brings any kind of issue like this, any criminal issue to the club, will be automatically, you know, took out of the contract. And I kind of gulped because I was already on bail for a nightclub fight. So I was in a nightclub. It got aggressive, and I'd headbutted somebody and been charged with assault in the nightclub. While I was getting thrown out of the nightclub, I've wrestled with some police and ended up with some assault PCs. So I had a court case pending, and rather than shouting up at the time and explaining the situation, I went to court hoping that I'd get away with it and I could just carry on with my rugby. But I didn't. I was given 8 months young offenders institution, which meant I would serve 4 months, 16 weeks. But as soon as I went to prison, the club cancelled my contract. And that's where really, Dudley, I gave up hope, because I'd achieved the pinnacle of everything my drive to become pro stemmed from my root issues of thinking I was no good and that I was going to be a failure. So I trained like a machine. I worked so hard to make it pro. I made it pro, and I got carried away with the money, with the glitz, the glamour, the fame side of it, because it was the pinnacle of rugby league. Then once in custody, I was a professional rugby player, I was 18 by then, 18 years old. I kind of had, you know, the world at your feet, as they call it, but I was in prison. You know, I'd lost my contract, but also I completely give up. And with 18 months of that, I was begging on the streets of London as a heroin and crack addict. That's how quick the spiral of decline went once I'd given up on myself and given up on my beloved rugby career.
Amazing, amazing. Well, if you've just joined us, you're watching the reality show. I'm Dudley Anderson. So good to have your company. Today we're talking to Allen Langham, who had a prospect of an excellent future as a professional rugby league player, but being consumed with anger and some frustration and wrong thoughts on the pitch and off the pitch in his training. Sadly, Allen abandoned his career, fell away, and got involved in drugs and violence. Allen, what an incredible situation you found yourself in. So you left the sport. Were you disappointed? Were you disappointed in yourself that it had all come crashing down?
I was distraught, Dudley, absolutely distraught, because I had no other backup, no other options. You know, it was everything. I'd achieved all the goals that I'd set against the tide. I'd have to swim upstream, you know, really to make it pro. A lot of people, you know, and I had a couple of failures where I went for trials at other clubs and didn't make the grade. And I kind of really questioned, you know, my ability. But thankfully, Gary Everton saw something in me that some of the other clubs didn't. And under his guidance, I shone very quickly. That pre-season, you know, I was absolutely on fire for such a strong, powerful fit, and probably one of the most happiest times of my life. You know, I'd signed my contract, I was trained, I was fit, I was healthy, I was well. And for me, I think the off-season was the detriment to my career, because obviously I then just were nightclubs and everything else. But what it was is it within me, Dudley, was a desperate need to be accepted, to be wanted, to be needed, and to be part of like a family unit. So when I went into prison, I didn't know what to expect or what I was going to be faced with. But what I tried to do is integrate with people that I had there was nothing in common with us whatsoever. I was a professional, strong, fit rugby league player, you know, with a family that loved and cared for me. And unfortunately, I was going through the trauma of just losing our mum just a few years before that, you know. But what I did is I tried to become part of the prison family. So I started to learn new things. I started to dabble in heroin and dabble in different things, which were just the things that was in the prison. I didn't realize the danger of these things whilst it was happening. But also, I was trying to mask this deep hurt inside because I was, from as young as I could remember, I was battered and beaten and abused and all this garbage feelings that I had, some of the most atrocious things that can happen to someone in life I'd gone through and I'd survived, but the wounds that I was carrying were so deep and so vast that nothing filled that, Dudley. And I was craving, you know, to be part of something. Unfortunately, I made the wrong choices by choosing to be part of prison life and prison culture. I was released after 16 weeks. I was already on bail for another offence. I had another fight, another quite a violent disorder in the outside a bar. You know, there were 4 of us went to court. I got another 6 months. I was back in prison again within less than a year. And then at that point, I really started to heavily use heroin in prison because some of the people in prison wanted me to be their protection. And they started giving me free drugs and free prison currency to fight their battles. And I came out from that sentence partly addicted, and then I met somebody in the community who I'd been in prison with, and I took it on for the first time in the community. Obviously, then you could get your hands on a lot more. So that was literally within 9 months of that, I was fully addicted, to the point it got as bad where I'd sold all the goods in my house. I'd stripped even the radiators and the boiler and anything just to get my hands on the heroin. And it got to the point then where I lost my home. People in my local community like made me leave the village because I was stealing off people and doing stuff that I would never ever have done if I wasn't addicted to heroin. And then I boarded the bus down to London and headed down to London to try and get clean and get sorted out. But that was probably the worst mistake I made, because in London I went through some of the hardest, horriblest things I'd ever had to experience. Living on the street, sleeping on the Strand of London at night, round Soho, Leicester Square, begging for money, stealing, doing whatever I could. Then I was introduced to crack while I was down there, and I became a fully fledged crack and heroin addict. And thankfully, which sounds crazy, Dudley, I actually got a 4-year sentence, which I generally believe saved my life, because I was then able to get off of heroin and crack. I got a picture of my firstborn daughter. I put it on the cell wall, and I said, right, it's time to rebuild that broken life. And for the next 2.5 years or 26 months, I trained and worked hard and educated myself, managed to do all the stuff I'd missed out at school, and started to build a backup plan. I need a plan B. I came out from that sentence, and Doncaster, my home club, signed me on a semi-pro contract, and St John Ollies give me a chance again at rugby league, and once again I was a first team player. This was Northern Ford Premiership. It wasn't quite as a high level as Super League, but it was a very good standard. And for me personally, it proved that we can overcome and we can make these challenges. Unfortunately for me and the club, I'd replaced the heroin and the crack with alcohol and cocaine. And again, I was working the doors as a bouncer and doing security for the pubs and clubs. So I wasn't out drinking, but I was around, the bouncers and working the doors. And that inevitably has led me back into fights, into the drug scene. And once more, through the close season, I went off the rails, beat somebody up quite badly, and ended up back in prison for 3.5 years. And again, I completely give up and get on myself again. But by this time, I'd had another child, another daughter, and I thought, how much longer are you going to live like this? And again, it was trying to come back from nothing and rebuild. So strength of character has never really been an issue, but the trauma and the emptiness that I felt inside was, and that lack of discipline, which I alluded to when we first started speaking, Dudley, just created an absolute mess of a man. But the older I got and the more prisons I served, the harder the heart got, the more the wall and the barrier came up, the more intimidating, the more violent I got, to the point that, I became, a high-risk violent offender and shipped out to Belmarsh, onto the Category A unit. I was a B category. Very rare that people with 3.5-year sentences would be as a B cat. But I was so volatile and violent that inevitably I mixed then with murderers, robbers, the worst kind of crimes in the country. Those people were put together in the secure unit in Belmarsh. And that for me was, I think, where I was at my very worst in violence. But something significant happened in that prison, Dudley, is I went down to the chapel again. I think I was always searching for something. And this was way back in 1998. And Sir David Powell was a prison minister there. And he had everybody lined up and they were praying over people. And he put his hand on my head. Then I thought, what's this language you're speaking? Is it Latin? I couldn't understand what this language was. Now I know it was the Holy Spirit and speaking in tongues. But he laid his hand on me and I felt like an electric go away from my body, but didn't think anything of it. But going back to 2013, where I had the symbol of the dove outside my window, I know that seed that had been planted all those years, again at my worst violent time, was then ignited and started to sprout and grow.
Fantastic. Wow, incredible. How God can change your life. The scripture says we're a new creation in Christ. The old is gone and the new has come, and we certainly can see that. Alan, you said that Jesus gave you what boozing and brawling couldn't, and now you use your hands for healing. So just in the next couple of minutes, tell us what are you up to? What is your work?
Yeah, so after getting saved in 2013, 10 years ago now, initially I was such zealous to share all this newfound love and passion and telling everybody I could meet about Jesus and what had happened in my life and how, I'd been turned upside down. This horrible, violent, nasty man was just bubbling with love, but I didn't have much wisdom, or discipline at that time. So I kind of was all over the place. But God saw something in me that I didn't see in myself. And over the last 10 years, he has restored every aspect of my life. My dad not being around when I was young, we've now got a relationship. Fantastic. He restored all my children back into my life in age order. I've got my 2 girls and my young son. My girls have grown up now. They're beautiful adults, beautiful women. My young son, he's playing rugby. He's like under 11s now and wants to kind of excel his father. And do you think I could do better than you? I said, I believe in your son, and my the same community that I terrorized with violence and intimidation and bullying nominated me in 2016 for the most inspirational individual of our community, and I won an award for that.
Okay.
And
yeah.
then something had changed.
Praise God.
So I formed a community interest company called Steps to Freedom. So what Steps to Freedom is about is taking people through my own steps to the freedom that I now live in, which inevitably is that journey of identity, of trauma, of aspirations and dreams and goal setting. But actually, Jesus is for absolutely everyone, but also there's the redemption and the healing is something that I believe that God's called me to offer to other people, because He's given me the ability to meet people in their brokenness.
Amen. That's amazing, Alan. That's absolutely incredible. Just quickly, do you have a website that we can contact?
Yeah, so there's allenlangham.com is my personal ministry website, and then stepstofreedom.co.uk.
Fantastic. Fantastic. Thank you. Wow. What an amazing story, how the Lord can change a broken life into a life mended by His grace. And, it's incredible to me as I was listening to Alan, how God used this simple thing of a dove, just a humble dove, to change such a strong man's life. Maybe you've got some questions as you've been watching up. Please drop me an email to my personal email address, dudley@surereality.net. I'd love to hear from you. Allen Langham, thank you so much for joining us today on The Reality Show. God bless you for your future.
God bless you. Thank you, Dudley.
Well, thank you so much for your company today. Do join us again next time on The Reality Show as we share the story of a life touched and changed by the reality of Jesus. Goodbye.